I'm making a case, and I'm happy to hear pushback. All the sources will be below. I'll look at the comments and love to engage in a discussion about this.
Well, you're on, Stefan. Here's my case against your characterization of the truth about Plato.
Plato versus Aristotle divides humanity between those who believe that the group is more important than the individual, collectivists, and those who believe that the individual is more important than the group, or individualists.
Okay, so this is already a no good, very bad start. If you're going to create the most general possible distinctions between Plato and Aristotle, you need to start with something that can actually withstand scrutiny. You could pick the contrast between being and becoming, for instance. Plato is concerned with timeless, eternal truths, like the fact that the three angles of a triangle all add up to 180 degrees, or any of the other discoveries of geometry and mathematics. Whereas Aristotle is more concerned with the ever-changing biological realm, where things are going through a process of becoming. Aristotle describes things as having a beginning, middle, and end. So Stefan could have made that broad distinction, being with Plato and becoming with Aristotle. Or if he wanted to get a little closer to what I think he's trying to say, he could have used the realist-idealist distinction. The realist-idealist distinction comes down to the different ways Plato and Aristotle tackle the problem of universals. So what is the problem of universals? I'll try to make it as simple as I can. When I point over there and I say tree, and then I point over there and I say tree, I have pointed at two separate things with very separate existences. They don't have an atom in common. But if those two things conform to the universal description tree, then I have said something true. And you can go over there and look at the two things and figure out if they rightly fall into the universal category of tree. But what is this universal thing called tree? Is it merely a useful fiction our brains invent for the purposes of categorizing things? That's what the nominalists would have believed. Or is there something in each of the particular trees that demands our recognition of the reality of treeness? Both Plato and Aristotle believe there is something very real about universals. The difference between them is that Aristotle believes that the existence of the universal is actually within the particular instantiations of it, while Plato believes that the idea of a tree is separate from the particular trees, but still very real. So Stefan could have used this broad distinction. Or, if he wanted a more political distinction, he could have picked liberal versus conservative. Aristotle's politics is certainly more respectful of human traditions and family structures, whereas Plato doesn't mind refashioning a city on abstract principles. This distinction would hold up to scrutiny, unlike individualist versus collectivist, but it also would put Stefan in the Platonic camp, because he typically sides with abstract principles over human traditions. So instead, Stefan tries to make the categories individualist versus collectivist, which, aside from being entirely anachronistic to the time period, has very little relationship to any valid distinction between Plato and Aristotle. All the Greeks at the time would have seen the polis, or the city-state, as something akin to an organism, with different parts having different functions. This equally applies to both Plato and Aristotle. And if you're going to credit one of those two philosophers with individualism, you should probably credit Plato, since the entire book of the Republic is devoted to the idea of what it means to be individually just, using justice within the state as a metaphor for individual justice. Okay, that's probably enough ranting on his first line, so let's move on.
But let's get started with a little bit of background.
For a few minutes, Stefan skims through some rather uncontroversial historical elements, so we're going to skip ahead a little bit.
It has been said, and I actually believe this, I made the case for this when doing my master's degree, just a few years ago, when I was arguing that every person is either a Platonist or an Aristotelian, and I'll get into why that's so important. And if you think these are ancient debates with no relevance to the modern world, I'm going to tie it in ways that you will never, ever forget.
Sadly, Stefan's listeners would be well advised to forget most of the connections Stefan is going to make, connections which will make their future understanding of Plato much more difficult.
So Platonism versus Aristotelianism, and I have, of course, the truth about Aristotle. You can look for it. I'll link to it below as well. Platonism is fundamentally about the challenge of concept formation. No, wake up. It's important. Stay with me. Very, very important. You'll need to maybe maximize this window from minimizing it while playing your video games. I know, I see. But it is really, really important. So we have these ideas in our mind that are aggregations of physical properties in the world, like trees have a particularly common characteristic, so does water and clouds and air and tables and so on. So we have these concepts in our mind that are supposed to accurately describe things in the world. Where do these ideas in our mind come from? Very, very interesting. So think about the phrase, the common good of mankind, the common good of the country, the common good of whatever, right? Is there such a thing as a common good? Does the idea of a forest, is it more important than the individual trees in the forest? Or is the idea of forest or a society or the common good or whatever, is that just a way of describing things in the world? And the things in the world are much more important than the concepts we use to describe them. If the concepts are more important, then you sacrifice individuals to the group, to the collective. If the concept is less important than the individual, then you have individualism, and there's no such thing as the common good. And if individuals choose to sacrifice, they can do so, but they're not morally commanded to do so.
Whoa. What just happened? Stefan was just expounding on a kind of shaky understanding of the problem of universals and then somehow ended up contradicting Jesus? Let's explore how this happened. The first thing to remember is Stefan's not actually picking up on a relevant distinction between Plato and Aristotle. As I explained earlier, both Plato and Aristotle believed in the reality of universals. But Stefan mistakes Aristotle for a nominalist. This is because he himself is unwittingly a nominalist, and he likes Aristotle, so he reads his own nominalism into him. But somehow, Stefan also links the nominalist perspective, which insists that there's no objective reality to universal descriptions, with individualism. Now, I should pause for a second to point out that there actually is a historical coincidence between nominalism and individualism. The rise of nominalist philosophy is associated with the rejection of scholastic-era philosophy, scholastic-era philosophy being very Aristotelian and therefore very realist. And the rejection of Aristotelian realist philosophy did coincide historically with the Protestant Reformation, the Renaissance, and the later Enlightenment. Of course, this historical happenstance of nominalism and individualism coinciding historically doesn't mean there's actually a logical connection between the two. And if there is one, Stefan hasn't expounded on it. What Stefan does instead is insist that the concepts he doesn't like, any concepts which he considers collectivist, like the common good, for instance, we should not even consider these concepts to be real things. Instead, he says that we should consider society and the common good as nothing more than the individuals that comprise it. But this is wrong in so many ways. Take the word man, for instance. Man is also an abstract concept, just like the common good. It is a universal. When you use the term man, you're not referring to any particular person walking around. You're instead referring to a universal concept or a form within which individual men participate. Discovering that particular men fit the universal description of man is how you intellect, how you know that they are indeed men. What Stefan says about the common good makes about as much sense as saying that we should never talk about man. What we should really think about are all those individual cells that make up his body. Those are much more important. When Stefan says there's no forest without the trees, that is trivially true, but that doesn't mean that all forests are imaginary or unimportant. There's also no individual man without the cells that make him up. So does Stefan think that man himself is imaginary? Or that he's somehow less important than those individual cells? Of course not. That would be absurd. Now, what does Stefan's confusion of individualism and nominalism have to do with Plato and Aristotle? Basically, nothing. As I explained before, Plato and Aristotle were idealists and realists, respectively, not nominalists. And as good Greeks, they would have also have seen the polis as something with a form of its own and an importance greater than the sum of its parts. And there's also one piece of irony here that I need to point out. Stefan's view of society as being nothing more than a mere collection of individuals, is actually more collectivist. It's more in line with the fascists than the philosophy of either Plato and Aristotle. The word fascist itself actually comes from the word fasces, which refers to a bundle of individual sticks. Unlike the Greek republicans who saw the polis as an organism, Italian fascists metaphorically described the collective as a bundle of individual sticks, which when joined together become stronger. Fascist governments weren't so much concerned with the common good of the political organism as a whole, but rather adhered to policies that arose from the general will, an applied form of majority rule. Okay, let's move on.
Stefan vamps on his confused idea that individualism has something to do with having a nominalist view of universal concepts for quite a while. But I'm going to stop here so we can listen to one particularly confused segment.
So for Platonism, this idea of this other world, and lots of philosophers have had this other world, right? Kant called it the noumenal realm. There is, of course, nirvana. There is other worlds that are much more important than this world, which is where our morals and our concepts and our ideas come from. There was a world spirit for some philosophers and so on. But for Platonism would be the empiricism of what Aristotle would call unreality. Like there's no other world of forms, but Plato thinks he's describing the truth when he's describing this world of forms, this universe of forms. So it's empirical for Plato. But for Aristotle, he said, well, they don't exist, they're not real, so this empiricism is not valid.
This empiricism is not valid. That statement makes zero sense, and neither did the statement, it was empirical for Plato. But even before these odd, unmeaning sentences, which probably should not have made the final cut of Stefan's video, he was already saying some pretty wacky things. He equated Kant's idea of the numinous, which essentially is the observation that everything we know about the objective world comes through the vehicle of our minds, and therefore what we know is always a step removed from what is actually there. He equates that philosophic perspective with supernaturalist religious views. This is a catastrophic category error, which, if internalized by any of the people watching Stefan, will make their understanding of Kant, which is already a difficult task, even harder for the future. It's almost as if Stefan can't even tell the difference between philosophy and myth. Okay, we get a little bit more history and background on Plato's life and all of that, so we're going to skip forward through most of this.
So the Peloponnesian War, this is a war between Athens and Sparta, in which Plato served briefly between 409 and 404 BC. Athens and Sparta, well, you know, maybe you've seen this in the movies that seem to have an enormous amount of abs. And Athens is like the intellectual, the refined, the abstract, the philosophical, and Sparta is throw your babies in the cold and see if they survive, and train relentlessly for war, and be very pragmatic and cold and hierarchical and dictatorial. And there were these two mindsets, right? Athens more individualistic, right? And Sparta more collectivist. And you can see again this kind of division, right?
Oh boy, here we go again. The same mistake Stefan made with Plato and Aristotle, he now repeats with Athens and Sparta. It's like his ideology makes him prone to reduce aspects of Greek history to his favorite false dichotomy, collectivism versus individualism. And once again, this dichotomy cannot withstand scrutiny. A much better dichotomy, which actually could capture the relevant distinction between Athens and Sparta, would be liberal and conservative. Just like today, how most of our coastal cities, New York, San Francisco, Fort Lauderdale, are liberal, and many of our smaller towns in the interior of the country are conservative, the same held true for the seafaring Athens and the landlocked Sparta. Yes, there are elements of liberal cities which will seem individualist to Stefan. For instance, the relative lack of dogmatic religious belief. But individualist does not really capture Athens any more than collectivist captures Sparta. Liberal and conservative does, though. Thucydides' history of the Peloponnesian War describes the character of the two cities, Athens and Sparta, when the Corinthians complain that Sparta won't go to war against Athens. Here's a quote. Spartans, the confidence which you feel in your constitution and social order inclines you to receive any reflections of ours on the other powers with certain skepticism. Hence springs your moderation, but hence also the rather limited knowledge which you betray in dealing with foreign politics. You, Spartans, of all the Hellenes, are alone inactive, and defend yourselves not by doing anything, but by looking as if you would do something. You alone wait till the power of an enemy is becoming twice its original size instead of crushing it in its infancy. Sparta here is described as slow to act, confident in their constitution and their settled ways of doing things. They're conservative. The Corinthians go on, and it's worth reading this part in full because of the vivid way the described contrast ends. Quote, "The Athenians are addicted to innovation, and their designs are characterized by swiftness alike in conception and execution. You, Spartans, have a genius for keeping what you have got, accompanied by a total want of invention, and when forced to act, you never go far enough. Again, they, Athenians, are adventurous beyond their power and daring beyond their judgment, and in danger they are sanguine. Your want, Spartans again, is to attempt less than is justified by your power, to mistrust even what is sanctioned by your judgment, and to fancy that from danger there is no release. Further, there is promptitude on their side and procrastination on yours. They are never at home. You are most disinclined to leave it. For they hope by their absence to extend their acquisitions. You fear by your advance to endanger what you have left behind. They, again this is the Athenians, are swift to follow up a success and slow to recoil from a reverse. Their bodies they spend ungrudgingly on their country's cause." Pause here. Note, this is hardly individualist according to Stefan's conception. Back to the quote. "Their intellect they jealously husband to be employed in her service. A scheme unexecuted is with them a positive loss. A successful enterprise is a comparative failure. The deficiency created by the miscarriage of an undertaking is soon filled up by fresh hopes, for they alone are enabled to call a thing hoped for a thing got, by the speed with which they act upon their resolutions. Thus they toil on in trouble, in danger, all the days of their life, with little opportunity for enjoying, being ever engaged in getting. Their only idea of a holiday is to do what the occasion demands, and to them laborious occupation is less of a misfortune than the peace of a quiet life. To describe their character in a word, this is Athens still, one might truly say that they were born into the world to take no rest themselves and to give none to others." End quote. One should be able to see in this description hints of the American Puritans, who work themselves to death even on holidays, modern liberals, who always have these fresh hopes whenever their policies fail, and also the free enterprise of America's major liberal cities, like New York with the stock exchange. Where in this contrast between liberalism and conservatism, between liberal Athens and conservative Sparta, is individualism and collectivism? The answer is nowhere. If we fast forward through some more uncontroversial history, sprinkled with some questionable connections to modernity, Stefan makes a related point again that I think is worth discussing.
This is very interesting because of his wide travel and his studying of other modes of thought, other entire ways of thought. There is something about a well-rounded education that can be wonderfully expansive to your thinking. However, unless you go in with a strict methodology for separating truth and from falsehood, it can very easily dissolve your standards into a kind of relativism. If you look at the sort of chaos and multiplicity of thought systems throughout the world, it's easy to just throw up your hands and say, well, you know, truth is cultural, ethics are just relative, it's whatever the society decides, and that can be a great danger.
When Stefan said well-rounded education here, I think he really just means exposure to different cultures. And this connects back to the point I just made about Athens being a liberal port city, where people of all kinds and from many different parts of the world will come in and stay for a while and live next to the native Athenians. By being constantly exposed to different ways of thinking and different religious beliefs, people who live in liberal cosmopolitan cities tend to be more atheistic and more relativist. A native Athenian might be like, well, I've been worshiping Athena over here, but my next door neighbor worships Vishnu or something, and he's not getting struck by lightning, so maybe all beliefs are the same. Maybe no way of thinking is better than any other. So Stefan is right that relativism is a danger in liberal cities like Athens. It's not a danger in Sparta, where, like good conservatives, they tend to believe that they already possess the truth. They have all the answers and just need to protect their already correct way of doing things. The Athenians, like good liberals, are always running after some new untested thing or theory. Stefan is also right that the philosophers, like Plato and Aristotle, possess something that prevents them from following the democratic liberal tendency toward relativism. Stefan calls it a strict methodology for finding truth, but this isn't quite right. There are a multiplicity of methodologies that one could adopt for finding truth that would prevent a person from becoming a relativist. What would unite all of those different methodologies is faith. It's the belief that an objective truth really does exist out there to be found, even if you're unsure of the right methodology to find it. It's the same faith that undergirds science. The belief that, despite our limitations as human beings, despite our finite minds, our reason will still be applicable in the most distant quasar, just like it is in our own backyard. As Nietzsche put it, quote, "It is always a metaphysical faith on which our faith in science rests. We seekers after knowledge today, even we godless anti-metaphysicians, still take our fire from the flame lit by a faith millennium old, the Christian faith, which was also the faith of Plato, that God is truth and that the truth is divine." Okay, we've got a little bit more background and history about the different periods of Plato's life and writings.
Plato suggests that the universe of forms is the only constant. The perceived world is mere deception and change. Now, this may sound kind of odd, but it actually is a very challenging idea. Out of the chaos and blur of sense data, we have this concept called clouds, but clouds are constantly changing. Sometimes they're present, sometimes they're absent. They take many, many different forms, from cirrus to cumulus to whatever in between. And if you've ever sort of had an afternoon, I remember I was studying the Second World War for a novel I was writing. I was listening to an audiobook, and I was lying on a field looking at the clouds all afternoon. It's really quite magical. And this chaos and flux of the world, that's a forest. Well, trees are being born, they're dying. There's a fire, there's an ice storm, trees fall down, trees are chopped down. When is the forest not a forest? It sounds like, easy or obvious, but it's actually quite complicated, and it's well worth examining, because you need to have clear delineations of your definitions. Otherwise, people use the fuzzy boundaries to dissolve concepts as a whole. So he needed to find constancy. And of course, if you look at Socrates, is related to Friedrich Nietzsche in many ways, in that he's kind of like an acid to your certainties. He dissolves like a termite going into the base of your mental structures. He goes in and he burrows and he digs, and to try and stand before the gales of skepticism that come out of Socrates and people like Nietzsche is really tough. I mean, he sandblasts you pretty clean of illusion, and what's left standing afterwards is pretty tough to figure out for a lot of people. It's why they kind of shy away from philosophy, that the idea that these winds of reason and skepticism and cross-examination are going to dissolve you into nothingness, that you're going to have nothing left over. You'll be scoured clean of certainty, of truth, of virtue, of value, of identity, of loyalty, of love. So in the face of this kind of skepticism and these cross-examinations that dissolve certainties, what is left standing? Well, for Plato, it was the forms.
Okay, so there's quite a bit going on here, and I'll try my best to pick it apart. The first point Stefan is making is that Plato needed to find constancy out of the chaos and blur of sense data. And this, in Stefan's mind, is why Plato made up the whole idea of the forms. But Plato was well aware of Heraclitus' flux theory, which is what Stefan seems to be describing when he talks about the clouds, and which Plato described as the idea that you can never step into the same river twice. Plato was not really looking for constancy, but for truth, and truth itself is constant. 2 plus 2, for instance, will always equal 4 forever and ever. It is unchanging, it is eternal, etc. In fact, the Greek word for truth is aletheia, or aletheia, however you pronounce it, which etymologically refers to the mythological river of forgetfulness in the underworld. So the very word truth refers to that which is not forgotten, letheia. Or, in other words, the timeless and eternal things which should not be forgotten. Plato's theory of the form arises not really out of a felt need for constancy, but rather from an observation about the nature of truth, its timelessness, its unchanging nature, etc. When the whole earth passes away, 2 plus 2 will still go on equaling 4 just as it always has. The other point Stefan made in this clip involved comparing Socratic questioning to an acid which dissolves certainties. He makes a comparison to Nietzsche, which is actually instructive. Socrates was, indeed, attacking the certainties of the poets and theologians in Athens at his time. Nietzsche also was reflecting on the fact that a similar thing was happening in Europe, that the old faith of Christianity was dying and that atheism was filling the gap. So in that way, Socrates and Nietzsche are similar, but they're also very different. Nietzsche accepted the dissolution of certainty and substituted in its place a will to power. Socrates does not do that. There are some scholars who interpret Socrates as an ironist or as someone who's just being playfully destructive, but I do not think that interpretation can withstand a proper reading of the Republic. It seems obvious to me that Socrates' skepticism has a point. He is searching for something. He has that faith that objective truth actually exists, unlike Nietzsche, for whom everything is violence. Stefan continues on this theme for a little while longer.
So around 385 BC, Plato founded the Academy, which he managed and was in charge of, and I assume the head educator until his death. Now, the Academy was the first university in Western history.
Okay, I know this is kind of a minor quibble, but I think there's good reason to keep the verbal distinction between academy and university. And the reason I think so is this. It was Aristotle that was really the polymath, not Plato. And that's why universities, which were started in the later Middle Ages, with the recovery of many of Aristotle's works and the rise of scholastic philosophy, which was very Aristotelian, the universities that were born at that time were aspiring to be universal in scope, covering all aspects of human knowledge. Plato's Academy, on the other hand, was really geared toward the kind of studies Plato was interested in, geometry, philosophy, metaphysics, those kinds of things. And I think it's worth keeping that distinction alive, where academy refers to a more specialized training in a particular field, and a university refers to those places which are intended to make you conversant in all the different aspects of knowledge. Okay, we're going to skip forward through the history of the Academy to where Stefan gives us a peek of his later critique of Plato, which is that he advocates for tyranny. The first hint of this is coming up when he suggests that Plato wanted to turn Dionysius II into a philosopher king, but that's not quite right. It was Dionysius' uncle, Dion, who sent for Plato to teach Dionysius philosophy, hoping that it would correct his lavish lifestyle.
He wanted to produce the first philosopher king, and we'll sort of get into the definition of that in a bit, but the philosopher king, Plato said the world will never know peace until either the kings become philosophers or the philosophers become kings.
It is worth pointing out the playful irony of this quote from Socrates. Remember, the Athenian government is sitting in judgment over Socrates and claiming that he is stirring up evils in the city. And instead of merely defending himself by saying, no, that's not true, I'm not doing any such thing, Plato describes Socrates as the ruler sitting in judgment over the very people who are condemning him. Socrates then, as the ruler, condemns them, saying that they are the reason that the city has no rest from its evil, and that the city will keep experiencing the same corruption until the tables are flipped and Socrates becomes ruler. This inversion, I should be the one judging you guys, is present in the Apology as well as the Republic, and it was not lost on the Athenian rulers. This context should be kept in mind whenever thinking about Plato's assertion that philosophers should rule as kings. Is he really setting up a prescription like this? Here, this idea will fix everything. Or is he merely criticizing the existing Athenian political structure by saying that they are beholden to an unreasonable and unphilosophic theology that is in desperate need of some philosophic ideas and some philosophic criticism? Stefan finishes the story about Dionysius and how he ended up putting Plato under house arrest and all of that. And then he starts giving some basic facts about Plato's bodies of works, the number of them, what they're about, etc. And even talks about the fact that because Plato writes in dialogue form and because of the craftsmanship of these works means they're almost certainly not mere transcriptions of what Socrates said, we really don't even know what the true views of Plato or Socrates are. And that's true. But after a little while, Stefan's individualist ideology rears its head again.
And I've always been struck, I think Socrates' last statement was to instruct one of his followers to sacrifice a chicken to a particular god. And that's what you do when you've received a great gift. So I think that he viewed death as a gift at this point in his life. And I make the argument in my series on the last days of Socrates that Socrates was actually very angry. And Plato portrays him as calm, but Socrates, in saying that we must always obey the state, even though he in no way associated virtue with the will of the state or the will of the people, was putting a curse on mankind that lasts to this day about obedience to the state.
No. The first part was on track. The reason Plato describes Socrates telling his friend that he owes a rooster to the god of medicine, in addition to showing that Socrates is piously following the religion of the state and also ironically pointing out that death is a welcome medicine, it also harkens back to the Republic, where Socrates uses the metaphor of the ideal city to describe the perfectly just individual. In that dialogue, the first definition of justice that is given was given by Cephalus, which in Greek means head, and for Plato referred to the ruling class of Athens. And that definition was, give back to each what one owes. So not only is Socrates being pious, he's also demonstrating his desire to go to the grave perfectly just, even according to the definition of Athenian religion. The second part of what Stefan said, though, makes no sense and comes apparently from a misinterpretation of Socrates' dialogue with Crito, where he resists Crito's admonition to flee punishment and instead chooses to stay and die an Athenian. Socrates' argument literally says the opposite of what Stefan wishes it would have said. Socrates takes the hypothetical position of Athens and argues against himself. He says, Socrates, you know how you owe allegiance to your parents? Well, because Athens also nurtured you and educated you, giving birth to the civilized person you are, you should stay. Also, you had the right to leave when you came of age. Athens gave you that right, but you chose to stay anyway, and by doing so entered an implicit contract with the city-state, which, by the way, is the first statement of social contract theory. In other words, Socrates, what right do you have to leave Athens when it executes judgment over you? But there's one other telling statement in that dialogue where Socrates says, still speaking as Athens, quote, of all Athenians, you, Socrates, have been the most constant resident in the city, which, as you never leave, you may be supposed to love. This, I think, is indicative of Socrates' point. He is admitting that he loves Athens and that he would prefer to die a faithful Athenian rather than live as a homeless wanderer on the earth. But, the love of Athenian identity does not really gel well with Stefan's ideology, and so Stefan would rather imagine Socrates cursing all of humanity and thus causing statism all over the world. Quite imaginative, but hardly relevant to anything Socrates actually said or did.
Now, what's fascinating, and this is something that explains a confusion that I had for some years about why Plato, who would seem to have a lot in common with Christian theology, right? The higher realm of perfection, and this is where you can place divinity and angels and so on. Why Aristotle was enormously popular during the Middle Ages. So in medieval times, the epoch, not the greasy chicken place, but Plato's reputation was almost completely absent during the medieval times. And his most famous student, Aristotle, was simply called the philosopher. Not a philosopher, the philosopher.
Okay, so Stefan admits during this segment that he's confused about medieval history, and he certainly is. The idea that Plato's reputation is almost completely absent during medieval times is, of course, unbelievably wrong. Medieval theology and philosophy were profoundly influenced by Plato. The two most important medieval philosophers, Augustine and Boethius, both began as Neoplatonists, which is a philosophy that came through Plotinus's development of Platonic philosophy. The way the medievals conceptualized angelology came through Pseudo-Dionysius, who was also a Neoplatonist. So most of the medieval era was dominated by thought that was more Platonic than Aristotelian, even though Aristotle was an influence as well. It was much later, during the High Middle Ages, after the works of Aristotle were reintroduced to the West, that Aristotle's influence increased, which is especially noticeable in the work of scholastic philosophers like Thomas Aquinas. And that's the guy who most famously referred to Aristotle as the philosopher.
So what happened was Plato's original writings were largely lost to Western civilization until they arrived from Constantinople in the century before its fall, right? So remember the Roman Empire, you had the eastern part and you had the western part. The western part fell long before the eastern part. The medieval scholastic philosophers had neither access to the works of Plato nor the knowledge of ancient Greek to read them.
Yes, Plato's writings were recovered a few hundred years after Aristotle's writings were recovered. But again, the history goes Middle Ages, very Platonic, very Neoplatonic. Later Middle Ages, more heavily Aristotelian because of the rediscovery of Aristotle's writings. And then the Renaissance period, where Plato's writings were recovered.
And Aristotle did this to some degree, but Plato helped as well. Medieval scholasticism was very esoteric.
No, it wasn't. It was actually extremely straightforward, to the point of being tedious.
And very, very concerned with attempting to unite theology with reason and evidence. So, a big question of the scholastics was, it sounds silly, but it's very, very important. Did Adam have a belly button? Right? Because we are made in the image of God. God himself can't have a belly button because God was not born of woman. And so if Adam was made in the image of God and we are descended from Adam, where does the belly button come in? If Adam has a belly button and God doesn't, then Adam wasn't made in the image of God. This sounds silly, but it's a very, very important questions when it comes to figuring out theology.
Frustrating. Stefan doesn't even get his own ludicrous description of scholasticism right. The "how many angels can dance on the head of a pin" type description of scholastic philosophy, which during the Renaissance was intended to caricature the very straightforward tediousness of scholasticism that I was telling you about, is completely unfair. But even when using a completely unfair description of scholasticism by describing scholastic philosophers as arguing over whether Adam had a belly button, somehow Stefan manages to get that caricatured argument wrong. One would think that if you really wanted to go down that road, which no scholastics did, but let's say for the sake of argument, you wanted to consider whether Adam had a belly button, surely you would consider the fact that Adam was never born and thus might not have any outward signs of having been born, like a belly button. But that's not where the ever-imaginative mind of Stefan Molyneaux went. No, the only time anyone in the world has ever opined that man being made in the image of God requires that he not have a belly button happened right here in this video. Scooting forward a little bit, Stefan opines that he likes the realism and proportion of the neoclassicism of the Renaissance period, and that's fine. but he ties that in with some fairly weird summary opinions, like this one about superhero movies.
The unreality that we have in art now, and the CGI, and the abstraction of courage, of moral courage, and it's uniting with superpowers and other galaxies and forces and lasers and so on, is a way of detaching the moral courage necessary to sustain our civilization and putting it to an abstract realm where courage requires magic. And since you don't have magic, you can't be courageous in the world.
Eh? I don't know what he means. Do you know what he means? Feel free to leave a comment and explain. Skipping forward again through some quotes about how important Plato is.
So the dialogues of Plato focus on the pursuit of truth and the understanding of what is good. Now, you'll notice that I've capitalized truth and good here. It's kind of like Cap's philosophy. Like, you know, gosh, what did it happen? It happened in The Matrix. It also happened when Oprah was talking about Obama. He is the one. The one. Not just, he is one. He's the one. Yeah, he's the one. He's the one. He's the one, officer. He is the one. Boom, 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 bum, bum, bum. Right? It is the one, Caps. And it's like, we're not in pursuit of, well, I'd like to know what the truth is. I know we are in pursuit of the truth. And it's Cap's philosophy. You put caps on, and that way you know it's something more than empiricism.
Or perhaps we shouldn't fear capitalization when it's used to differentiate abstract concepts from concrete instantiations. Like when you want to say that being is such and such. Or if you want to say something about the nature of truth in the abstract, or about nature in the abstract. You know, kind of like how the founders of the United States did when they wrote the Declaration of Independence. All right, so now we're ready to dive back into Stefan's rather wacky connection between Plato's forms and collectivism, which I talked about at the beginning of this video. Here's a place where he summarizes his take.
Basically what this means is if you have a concept of table, and you put something in the category of table, it can't contradict the general definition, right? You can't just throw a lizard in and say, well, this is just a table. And so if you think of the concept of public ownership, of collective property, so if you say property is a right of the individual, like we own ourselves, we own our bodies, we own our emotions, which is why we're responsible for crimes or things that we create. So we own our bodies, we own the effects of our actions, therefore we own what we create. Now, if that is a characteristic of the individual, then you can't have a collective concept that contradicts the rights of the individual.
Okay, so the first part of that made no sense, but when you see Stefan explain himself, you can realize what has happened. His logic actually goes backward from the way he stated it. You start with his view that collectives are bad and take away rights from individuals. This is just libertarianism 101. And then you say that a collective is an abstraction. So collectives are bad because they conflict with individuals. So abstractions or forms must be bad and conflict with sense data. Here, I'll play Stefan's clips in reverse order to help make the point.
So we own our bodies, we own the effects of our actions, therefore we own what we create. Now, if that is a characteristic of the individual, then you can't have a collective concept that contradicts the rights of the individual. Basically what this means is if you have a concept of table and you put something in the category of table, it can't contradict the general definition.
So if the application of collectivism versus individualism to Plato simply causes confusion, let's take that out for a second. When we do, we realize that what Stefan is wrestling with is not actually Plato at all, but rather with his own anarcho-capitalist views.
And so if human beings have property rights, you can't have an aggregation of human beings that then has the opposite of each individual's property rights. This is the fundamental idea behind taxation, right? That there's a collective concept called the state, which is in buildings and may have uniforms and has written down things like spells. And the concept of the state is based upon its capacity and willingness and the action of violating individual property rights. Like I can't go and tax you because that's called theft, but the state can tax us because you see this collective concept has a right that is the direct opposite of the right of the individuals. The individuals have the right to property and to be free of theft. But the state, you see, has not only the right but the obligation to violate the property rights of the individual.
See, Stefan is a believer in something called individual sovereignty, which is really just a figment of the anarcho-capitalist imagination. But if the individual is indeed sovereign, then no one has the right to take anything from him ever, including an elected government or whatever else. How children would ever survive in this imaginary world is anyone's guess, but that's not the point. The point is, the utter vacuousness of the concept the common good is an effect of Stefan's theory, not a data point that validates it. And there is certainly no justification for the leap from the idea that the common good is vacuous to the idea that forms are vacuous. So he keeps going on, vamping a little bit more about this. Let's drop back in here for another misguided summary.
So the purpose of philosophy, according to Plato, is to harangue you and disorient you and convince you that what you see and hear in the material world is just a degraded illusion. It is not the truth. It is not reality. Reality is the perfect world of the forms.
Once again, no. Plato is not haranguing you, nor is he disorienting you. He is merely describing something that everyone already knows, which is that while everything in the material world seems to be subject to decay, truths are not subject to decay. No matter how many chairs rot away, the concept chair remains solid. While a particular chair can burn and eventually be destroyed and lose its chairness, the truth about what a chair is remains the same. We're going to skip through Stefan's assertions about beauty, how it is objective, and also his belief that, regardless of beauty being objective, that the objective reality of beauty is supposed to be not able to be communicated, but instead requiring revelation. Because all that talk is bringing us to this.
That's one thing when you're talking about beauty. It's quite another thing when you're talking about virtue. The good cannot be objectively defined and communicated. Now, I've worked on this. I've got a whole book out there. Well, it's in Essential Philosophy. There's a book called Universally Preferable Behavior, A Rational Proof of Secular Ethics, where I work on the good in syllogistical format, and succeed. But if virtue cannot be communicated because it's revelatory, it's what? Inspiration, it's a magic moment. It's faith, in a sense. If the good cannot be communicated, then humanity, to be good, must be ruled. This is the tyrannical aspect of the theory of the forms.
Aye. We are way out in left field on this one. Look, the entire dialogue of the Republic is predicated on the idea that the good can be communicated. In it, Socrates metaphorically describes himself, or Plato describes him, descending down into the cave after having exited and seen the light. After he sees the light, he descends back inside the cave to help others escape. That is a metaphor for what Socrates is doing in the Republic. He's rescuing Glaucon from the cave. That is why, near the center of the book, Glaucon has his eureka moment, where he realizes the truth of what Socrates has been saying. So, yes, the good can be communicated, according to Plato. It just can't be communicated in a way that Stefan will accept as valid. Stefan, apparently, tries to do the same thing that Sam Harris and all the other new atheists eventually try to do, and this tends to become a bastardized version of what Kant tried to do with his creation of the categorical imperative, and that is, they try to deny the reality of what David Hume discovered with his is-ought distinction. No description of the natural world through the means available through the scientific method, in other words, no empirical test, can ever lead to ethics, or universally preferable behavior, as Stefan calls it. And by the way, why isn't universally preferable behavior just another one of those abstract concepts that are collectivist in that they might contradict what certain individuals desire? I assume that when an individual tries to break Stefan's ethical code, Stefan would be able with perfect logic to cast the violator out, throw him in the gas chamber. After all, they broke universally preferable behavior. But anyway, getting back to Plato, when Glaucon has his aha moment in the Republic, he has not done a scientific experiment, nor has he created a categorical imperative. He has found nothing that arises through sense experience, and yet, something has been communicated to him. Here's a quote from the Republic. Glaucon says, "You mean that he will be a ruler in the city of which we are the founders, and which exists in idea only, for I do not believe there is such a one anywhere on earth." Socrates replies, "In heaven there is laid up a pattern of it, I think, which he who desires may behold, and beholding may set his own house in order. But whether such a one exists or ever will exist in fact is no matter, for he will live after the manner of that city, having nothing to do with any other." The insight is that the virtuous person, through a desire for goodness, truth, and beauty, by aiming for those things, will be better able to see them and understand them. In other words, by being virtuous, you learn what virtue is. By behaving justly, you learn what justice is. And in a sense, what Socrates has done is make a disciple out of Glaucon. Far from corrupting him, as the authorities were accusing Socrates of doing, he has rather convinced Glaucon that to be just is better than being unjust, regardless of the situation or the consequences. The funny part is that Stefan Molyneaux actually agrees with this. He shares that belief. Stefan does not think that beauty is just in the eye of the beholder. He does not think that morality is what anyone or any group happens to want. And his faith in objective morality is manifested in his misguided quest to find universally preferable behavior through sense experience and empirical data alone. One can almost imagine how a modern-day Aristophanes might describe Stefan Molyneaux or Sam Harris or Richard Dawkins. Perhaps all three of them would be shown on stage, hunched over their microscopes, their clothes all unkempt, all sorts of buzzing and boiling and whirring going on from several different scientific experiments that they're all doing at the same time. And then every so often, one of them sticks their head up and says, "Behold, I have discovered morality." And then all the other scientists come over and debunk him, and then they all go back to the very same task. Anyway, despite the entire Republic being about convincing Glaucon through dialogue to be just, Stefan manages to turn it into this.
The only way that human beings can be good, since the vast majority of human beings cannot understand and appreciate the forms, the only way that humanity can be good is to damn well do what those who understand the forms say, or else. Or else.
Yeah, no. Plato's description of Socrates has him convincing people through reason and argument that his ideas about virtue are true. Literally the exact opposite of what you just said.
It's one thing to say, well, there's this abstract realm and blah, 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 but you start putting that into political practice. And this was my master's thesis. I examined the works of major philosophers throughout Western history. Every single time they believed in a higher realm, they believed that dictatorship was the ideal political form.
We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. Sound familiar? There it is. There's your higher realm. There's that scary capital N nature and that capital G God. Ooh, scary stuff. And yet, lo and behold, not in the service of dictatorship at all.
And every time they were empiricists, Aristotelians, they believed that limited democracy constitutional democracy, republic, some form of that was the ideal political form.
Really now. Republicanism is loved by everyone but Plato, writer of The Republic. Here Stefan goes on for quite some time, making the same mistakes he made early in the video, not even grasping what Plato's idealism really even is, but insisting dogmatically that it is dead wrong and should not be taken seriously.
So the entire foundation, like if you get the metaphysics wrong, the actual nature of reality, because there's two realms, right? The mere pathetic empirical realm and then this perfect ideal realm of forms. You get your metaphysics wrong, then your epistemology is going to be wrong. Because now it's not about learning about the material world and developing science and reason and evidence and all of that. It's about exploring in your mind this ideal perfect realm that you can never prove. So if you get your metaphysics wrong, nature of reality, you get your epistemology wrong, which is nature of the study of truth, of accuracy.
Nope. No, it isn't. Epistemology is not the study of accuracy or truth, but the study of how it is that we come to know things.
Now, if you get your epistemology wrong, you're going to get your politics wrong.
Well, technically, ethics was supposed to come next. Then you can do politics. Metaphysics asks, what is real? Epistemology asks, how do we know what is real? And then ethics asks, what do we do with our knowledge? Politics is downstream of that. Stefan now goes on repeat, back through some of his same complaints about forms and capitalization and whatnot, and then he repeats the idea that Platonic idealism is linked to tyranny.
So this is always the question I have with someone like Plato. Why is he classified in the realm of philosophy? Because his propositions, his arguments, his perspectives are not empirically provable. They are anti-rational. They are anti-empirical. They are anti-scientific.
I don't really hear questions in there, Stefan. Those are assertions. But perhaps you should have asked a question. Why is Plato classified as a philosopher by every other rational human being on the planet except you? Well, it might have something to do with the fact that Plato does not merely assert unprovable things, but instead dialogues and presents arguments. And maybe your confusion lies in the fact that you conflate empirical proof with rationality, thus deeming anything that is not sense data bewilderingly as anti-rational. More and more and more about how Platonic metaphysics cannot be empirically proved, which is, of course, still completely unremarkable because no metaphysical stance can be empirically proved, and that includes empiricism.
So not only did Plato almost 2,500 years ago fail to prove the core aspect of his metaphysics, which is the higher realm of forms, but nobody ever since has been able to do it. So if you have a foundational error that has lasted for 2,500 years almost, and you're considered still a great philosopher, well, why? The question is why? Well, the answer, I believe, and I'll talk about more of this at the end, but the answer is that Plato serves the preferences and power lust of those who wish to rule over us. Because through Plato, you can maintain the fiction of the collective good, of collectivism as a whole, as the tribe over the individual, as the social good, as the common good. And so what he does is he builds a giant abstract scaffold around the superstructure of political power that holds us all in its thrall. So he's useful.
So, the same guy who says that the ones who should rule are the ones who have the least desire to rule, that is the guy who is emboldening power-lustful tyrants around the world. Because collectivism, or something. More of the same, more of the same, more of the same.
If you come to philosophy through Plato, you think it's basically, just like the sort of cliche of the dorm room thick with marijuana smoke where people are saying like, hey man, wouldn't it be wild if the solar system was like actually an atom in the couch of God's den? Prove, don't prove. Wouldn't it be weird if we were all growing at the same time and at the same rate, but we didn't know it because everything, including everything we measured science with, was growing at the same time? We've been here before, right? And then everybody has this coincidence story, like, yeah, I dreamed of this elephant falling over. I went to the zoo and an elephant fell over, and, like this, it's coincidence. And it's not philosophy. It's not philosophy. So anyway, just sort of point that out.
Does anyone in the world know what this guy is talking about? Show me one passage in any dialogue of Plato that sounds remotely like that. Okay, so there was quite a bit of vamping on this. So we have to make a huge jump past all of the talk about how Stefan wishes Plato didn't write in dialogue form, but rather wrote treatises like Aristotle. He graciously forgives Plato because he thinks Plato was writing this way under duress, because writing in a straightforward manner could have got him killed. Then Stefan moves to reading through the entire allegory of the cave for some reason, but finally shifts to Plato's scientific theories.
It's the four elements: fire, air, water, and earth, which were composed of various combinations of triangles, were turned into compounds into the body of the universe. And, again, it's a nice story, I guess. And again, this to me, this sort of creation myth without any particular scientific basis, certainly wouldn't be recognizable as science now, again, puts him squarely in the camp of theology.
No, it doesn't. These kinds of theories were the very beginnings of science. The idea that the world is made up of tiny individual parts, or particles, which were individual in a very literal sense, meaning they cannot be divided, the word atom actually coming from atom, which literally means not cut, something that you can no longer cut in half because it's so impossibly small. These theories, which broke down the world into atomic particles, were revolutionary. And like Democritus's theory of atoms, Plato theorized that everything was made up of tiny parts, and that the differences of the shapes of these parts manifested itself in the different characteristics of the substances they make up. To say that this is unscientific is not to grasp science in the slightest. This is quite literally science at work. Science always involves wild speculation about the way the world works, based on whatever wide variety of data you have at your disposal. Obviously, over the centuries, these speculations would be refined and tested, but it takes minds that are capable of imaginative speculation to send science down a path like this, much like how Einstein sent science down a completely different path than what came before him. The fact that we're still using atomic theory today should tell you something about the forward-thinking and fertile minds of the Greeks. To call an incorrect scientific theory theology is simply to commit another catastrophic category error.
Plato said that spoken philosophy was superior to written philosophy, and I actually can't help but agree with him on that. Of course, the fact that Socrates didn't write anything down and was engaged in a lifelong conversation about philosophy was important. And the idea that the exploration of ideas is better manifested in verbal rather than written form is very, very important. And it's something that technology has enabled philosophy to return to the spoken form. Right? I speak with you, I engage in debates. Lots of people are now contributing to the world of philosophy through online media, through spoken form, rather than just the written form. And I think that's wonderful.
Okay, so there are two things that Socrates says about speech versus writing, which I think are very interesting. The first has to do with the effect of memorization on children. And this is why even today you'll see classical academies which try to resurrect the Platonic model of education, and they'll use a lot of rote memorization for the younger ages because those minds are fertile and can recall things easily. With the advent of writing, especially later the codex form of book, that does seem to have an effect on people's ability to remember. And so there's something to be said for that. The second thing that Socrates says that's interesting is that writing is fossilized speech. And again, I think Socrates is right about that. When you're speaking, the words are alive in a way that they're not after they have been written down. You cannot ask a book to clarify itself the way you can ask a speaking person. When you're in dialogue, that's an activity. When you talk with someone, you also know that behind those words lies the spirit of those words. So when someone says something that you intuit to be incorrect, you ask for clarification. And all the while, during the discussion, the words are just tools that you're using to communicate ideas and meaning which pre-exist the words in the mind of each person. But once those words get written down on the page, the living act of speech becomes fossilized on the page. And now it can become fossilized in a very organized way, and philosophers like Aristotle took pains to explain themselves over and over thoroughly so that they would not be misunderstood. But the life of those words still was lost. I find it rather funny that Stefan Molyneaux endorses this rather spiritual view of speech. I would have rather expected him to say, no, there's nothing more to speaking and writing than the words themselves. If Stefan were consistent, the idea that there's something behind the words, or in another mental realm, would be, theological kind of stuff. But why be consistent when you can glorify your own YouTube-style philosophy over conventional, academically rigorous approaches? Skipping ahead yet again through some similar stuff to Plato's consideration of epistemology. As is typical for Socrates, he questions those he interacts with rather than giving dogmatic answers himself, and this bothers Stefan.
So he argues against each of them in turn, leaving the reader without any definitive conclusion. And this is part of the annoying nihilism of this kind of philosophy. And of course, what he's trying to do is he's trying to disassemble your reliance upon sensuality, sense data really, empiricism, rationality, the objectivity of the material world we absorb through the senses. He's trying to break that down so to crack your certainty so you can go through that crack, like up the cave, exit, and see the forms, right? So he's got to crack down, like postmodernism, right?
No, neither Socrates nor Plato is a postmodernist or a nihilist. What we're seeing here is the intellectual shallowness of Stefan's secular empiricism. Why does Stefan think that Socrates' exploration of the idea of knowledge is bad? Well, that's because Stefan already thinks he knows just what knowledge is. He's kind of like the Spartan conservative who's sure he has all the answers. It's the scientific method, stupid! So the fact that Socrates doesn't just come out and say what Stefan wishes he said, which is truth equals science, and instead Socrates actually explores the thorny problems of metaphysics, well, that must mean that Socrates has a nihilistic philosophy. It's almost like Stefan thinks that the kind of answer Socrates should have given goes like this. Hey Socrates, what is knowledge? Oh, well that's obviously only that which can be verified by the scientific method. Why did you ask such an obvious question? But even if Socrates had given that answer, guess what? There would be no way to verify that answer scientifically or empirically. So it would have to be accepted on faith. Because Socrates doesn't give this faulty 18th century positivist response to the question of knowledge, the answer that Stefan happens to have faith in, Plato must be trying to crack your certainty or be leading you towards postmodernism. Now, there is one sense in which Stefan is right. Not about Plato or Socrates being postmodernists, of course, but Socrates is against a kind of dogmatism. And it's the kind of dogmatism of guys like Stefan Molyneaux. If someone opposes Stefan's not very well thought out dogmatic positivism, that's not nihilistic. In fact, Socrates breaks those kinds of ideas down because, as I said before, he's searching for the truth, and he believes it's out there to be found. And this brings us full circle, back to that internal incoherence of Stefan's criticism of Plato. On the one hand, Stefan is just like Plato. He's a firm believer that objective reality and truth actually exist. But, on the other hand, just like many people whose minds have been tilted towards secularism for a variety of reasons, Stefan takes this belief in objective truth, which he shares with Plato, and then binds it to the scientific method, so that what you get, instead of a dogma like, there is no God but Allah and Muhammad is his prophet, you get a dogma like, Objective truth exists, but the scientific method is the only way you can access it. Now, as I explained before, this dogma is plain, unimpressive 18th century positivism. And it's the kind of dogmatism that Socrates would have gone after with a pickaxe. But this particular dogma is also very enchanting in our secular age, especially for atheists and those who reject the insight of David Hume and imagine they're going to put so many scientific sentences together and get morality to magically appear. After this, Stefan dunks on communism for a little while and then gets back to Plato. And I'd like to solidify my last point by dropping in where Stefan attempts to distance himself from Plato's idea that truth can be found by seeing through all the changing sense data to timeless, stable, eternal truths. And by way of contrast, Stefan says, no, Plato. You find certainty through sense data by seeing through it to... I'll just let Stefan make the point.
Well, you can get to certainty through the senses because the world is stable and objective. So,
and there it is. Stefan sharing Plato's faith in an objective, stable reality underneath all that ever-changing sense data.
Plato also suggested that real knowledge is recollection, anamnesis, and not of learning, observation, or study, right? It's sort of like... No, I don't know. Okay, I'll make the reference because it's kind of old now, but there was a Jennifer Garner show from many years ago called Alias. And at one point she has to remember something, but she can't remember it. So they put her in like a deep hypnotic state and she's got to go back and remember something. And it's kind of like that real knowledge is let go your conscious mind. Like real knowledge is falling back through the tunnel of time to before you were born, back up the birth canal, pre-egg, pre-sperm, when your soul was still drifting around like cumulus clouds up in the realm of the forms, that the real knowledge is no longer being distracted by the empirical evidence of your everyday life, of your waking life, and going back to the realm of forms that was around before you were born. In other words, the entire purpose of this teaching is to unlearn everything that you've learned in the waking world. But don't worry, it's still philosophy, apparently.
Look, Stefan, when you teach someone geometry, do you need to use anything in the physical world? No, you don't. In fact, if you use things in the physical world, that can lead to problems. If, for the purposes of illustration, I make a right triangle out of a paperclip and then ask a child to figure out what the other two angles add up to, would you recommend that they get out a protractor and measure the angles and risk getting an answer of 89.95 degrees, which would be wrong? No, it would be better to keep the child's considerations in the realm of the ideal triangle, or the form, and not whatever imperfect instantiation I can come up with. Without any sense data at all, considering only the ideal form of a right triangle, you can get the student to the right answer. All of mathematics is this way. Do mathematical discoveries take place because some archaeologist digs up some dirt somewhere and finds the quadratic equation? No. Or does a scientist put two liquids in a beaker to produce the Pythagorean theorem? Of course not. What you are discovering with mathematics are things that are eternally, unchangingly true. Regardless of whether we can ever get the material world to fully conform to our mathematical idea in the way that we'd like. Nowhere in the world does a perfect right triangle actually exist. Nowhere does a perfect circle exist. Yet, regardless, it remains true that for a perfect circle, which no one has ever seen, the circumference is exactly the length of the diameter times pi.
So truth is not empirical, but basically it's indistinguishable from divine insight because it's not objective, it can't be communicated, you can't draw a picture of the forms, you can't describe them in rational ways, and you certainly can't prove them rationally or empirically. You can't.
Empirically.
There's no sense data, right? So it's absolutely indistinguishable from divine insight, which is why I would put Plato in the realm of theology, not philosophy.
Yes, you absolutely can prove that the two angles of an ideal right triangle equal 90 degrees. But you don't prove it empirically. Rational and empirical do not mean the same thing, as Stefan seems to think.
So with regards to ethics, Plato had a goal-oriented approach. Well, see, he couldn't go on principles, right? So the way that ethics should work is you have your abstract principles, the non-aggression principle, do not initiate force. You have property rights, you have keep your word, honesty, contract law, and so on. You have principles. And because you have principles, everything kind of unrolls from there. But of course, if the true one, good, virtue, all caps or beginning caps universe is incommunicable to others, you can't have a principled approach to ethics. So he has a goal-oriented approach. Sometimes you could call this utilitarian or pragmatism or consequentialism, the greatest good for the greatest number, the greatest happiness of the greatest number, and so on. And that is the consequences. Whenever you hear that kind of stuff, this sort of calculus of happiness, and you try a bunch of stuff, you figure out what works and makes people the most happy, you are dealing with, well, it's not even theological approach, because the theological approach to ethics, at least in the Judeo-Christian world, is thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not bear false witness, thou shalt not murder. So those are principles, right? They're not well, see if you murder and see how you go murder and see how you feel, like Crime and Punishment Raskolnikov style. And so whenever you see this goal-oriented approach, then you know that somebody does not have objective rational ethics that they can communicate.
So Stefan does not like an ethics where you try one way of doing things, see if it fails, and then try another. No, that approach would be much too empirical. Instead, he likes abstract principles and thinks that ethics should flow from the contemplation of these abstract principles, and then that we should make our actions conform to those abstract ideas. Let that sink in for a second. Now, there were all sorts of other confusions embedded in this segment. One was the conflation of consequentialism with goal-oriented ethics, which I can only assume means Greek teleology. But those are not the same thing. Another problem was that Stefan said that the consequentialists do not have objective rational ethics. And that's exactly backward. Moral systems like utilitarianism have nothing but rationality. It's like, great, you figured out impressive equations for calculating the happiness units of every sentient being. Now tell us why on earth we should subject ourselves to your hyper-rational tyranny. Skipping ahead.
So virtue is a form of spiritual excellence of the soul, according to Plato. And, this is just, adjectives, positive words. I don't really know what it means in terms of practicality.
I like this bit of intellectual honesty from Stefan Molyneaux. He's right. He has no idea what Plato means. But first thing to notice is that Plato never defines virtue that way. The Greek word arete, which we translate as virtue, actually just means excellence. The excellence or virtue of the physical body is obvious: health, strength, agility, and all that. The excellence of the soul is a bit more difficult to define. I'm not exactly sure where Stefan picked up the line that he attributes to Plato, virtue is a form of spiritual excellence of the soul, but it's obviously someone's rather clunky attempt to describe what Socrates is talking about, and not some deepity uttered by Plato himself. Next, Stefan describes Plato's divisions of the soul. The first time he does it, he gets it wrong, conflating the word passions with the word appetites, and thus mixing up the virtues associated with each. But he fixes this the second time around when he comes to that portion of the Republic. That part of the video was obviously recorded at a different time. Then he talks about what he calls Plato's ideal state, which is a misleading translation of Socrates' city in speech, which is the hypothetical society he builds in the Republic in order to illustrate the difficult-to-define psychological virtues. But Stefan thinks that Plato is actually creating a prescription for tyrants, and he thinks Plato does so out of anger against the mob which killed Socrates, the term mob apparently referring to the democratic government of Athens. I'm going to drop in here where he talks about how in the Republic, children are raised in common. And here, Stefan cuts Plato a little bit of slack because there is some meritocracy, which Stefan appears to imagine would include IQ tests.
There's some meritocracy. So if you're born in the productive classes, but you're super smart, then you could be skyhooked out of that, right? The claw, or you could skyhooked out of that, and you could be dropped into the governing classes. If you are not so smart in the governing classes, but you are very brave, then you maybe would be dropped into the protective classes. So there's some shuffle based upon meritocracy, and that is important, right? So you get promoted according to your value, and I assume there would be some kind of objective tests or measures for this kind of stuff.
It was during this very next segment where Stefan Molyneaux goes through a handful of quotes from Plato, where I really realized how dependent his view of Plato is on the ideology of anarcho-capitalism. Every one of the quotes he mentions come in order from an obscure book on socialism written by a woman named Elizabeth Al-Tamidly. The book makes the same misguided argument that Plato is the origin of collectivism. I would heavily recommend that Stefan or any of his listeners, if they really want to understand Plato, they should cancel their subscription to Mises.org and read Plato for themselves. Reading Plato through the lens of ANCAP ideology is how you get these 4-hour-long videos of a guy saying, collectivism, to a series of slides on Plato's teachings. Consider Stefan's reaction to the final quote.
This is, put to death. He has become the mob that he was afraid of, right? Plato here, saying he's put to death. Appears to be corrupted. What is the objective standard for appears to be corrupted? Is that not exactly the same standard that Plato so decried being applied to Socrates? The appearance of corrupting the young, the appearance of not believing in the gods of the city.
It requires some context to understand Plato's meaning here. The accusation that Socrates was corrupting the youth was not without objective evidence. Socrates was the teacher of Alcibiades, who quite literally and objectively became a traitor, defecting first to Sparta and then to Persia. And then, when he returned to Athens, they made him a general again. With this law, Plato is actually defending Socrates, saying that, if somebody goes abroad, like Alcibiades did when he committed treason, and they return home spewing some foreign propaganda, we're not just going to sit idly by and let them take the reins in Athens again. Plato's law would not have restricted Socrates at all, but rather his treasonous student who traveled abroad and was corrupted. To put this in perspective for anarcho-capitalists, let's say that Bernie Sanders, instead of merely visiting the Soviet Union, instead was employed by the Kremlin in the 1980s. Then, let's say he came back to the United States to run for political office while the Soviet Union is still a thing. Would it be collectivism to bar him from holding public office? Or to in some way restrict the spread of communist ideas? It's an interesting question, and we shouldn't fault Plato for not spontaneously generating the Enlightenment doctrine of free speech. Stefan returns to the Republic again, seeing it not as an ideal city useful as a metaphor for individual justice, but rather as a prescription for tyranny.
I mean, come on. How bad does it have to be before we say, well, we don't say that Mein Kampf is a wonderful introduction to political philosophy, but we'll say, yeah, you got to read the Republic because it's a great introduction to philosophy. Plato is just so. Oh, my God.
I have no words. Comparing the Republic to Mein Kampf. Stefan launches into some weird tangents about the effects of homosexuality on Greece and other various things that we're just going to skip.
I mean, how? I mean, can you imagine if I had put forward anything? I'm sorry to laugh. I mean, I never would. Can you imagine that if I had put forward or someone else had put forward these kinds of ideas? Totalitarianism, judicial murder whims, everybody controlled by the state, massive government control over the economy. Oh, people seem to like that these days. And eugenics and fake marriages to make sure that the strongest breed with the strong, and killing babies if there's overpopulation, and a system that results in brother-sister incest on a regular basis. And people would say, you monster, and they'd be right.
At this point, this kind of thing should be embarrassing. Getting mad at Socrates for not putting in an anachronistic caveat on the Republic Reader beware. This hypothetical city I'm creating for the purposes of illustration might violate the Enlightenment sensibilities of some anarchist YouTuber in the future.
Well, of course, again, if you want to have power over people, you have to destroy their ability to think for themselves, which means you've got to have this otherworldly, noumenal realm, the nirvana realm, the realm of the forms, and so on, which it's really true, but you can't understand it, so just shut up and obey. Well, he serves power, right? He serves power. That's why he has remained popular.
How can anyone with even passing familiarity with Plato say that the reason that he's popular is because he serves power? Using the word power, ironically, in a very form-like way. I mean, which power is he referring to exactly? Would any reasonable person in the world really say that the Western nations that are influenced by Athenian thought, mostly through Plato and his pupils, could they reasonably say that Western nations are more prone to tyranny than non-Western empires and powers, which have no Platonic influence? Come on.
For Plato, there is no such thing as constant or innate human nature. Right? So he's a radical proponent of the nurture hypothesis.
Well, this is obviously incorrect. The Republic, for instance, is a diagnosis of the human soul. And Socrates' metaphorical comparison of different types of souls to different metals would seem to indicate that he thinks some people are born to be part of certain classes. And from the launching pad of this nature-nurture mistake of his, Stefan launches into another attack on the collectivism of the modern left, thinking that he's arguing against Plato. He goes back yet again to the ideal city of the Republic and sees his mortal enemy, Marxism. I'm also going to skip through his discussion of the democratic regime from Book 8 of the Republic, and also his discussion of the laws, both of which Stefan uses as a springboard for musings about modern politics. The differences I have with Stefan in this section are smaller and not really worth parsing out in this video. Okay, I'll stop for just one.
Plato was somewhat more friendly to women than Aristotle, and that's an important, it's a weakness of Aristotle, to put it mildly.
Look, Stefan, if you didn't see Plato as a collectivist compared to Aristotle the individualist, this would not be shocking at all. Plato's vision of the ideal city is radically liberal, kind of like Jesus' vision of the kingdom of God, where there's no male nor female, etc. Aristotle, the conservative, would naturally not have supported the as yet completely untested idea of giving traditionally male roles to women. Next, Stefan discusses the arts. And here, Stefan is talking about how Aristophanes' play, The Clouds, colored the Athenians' perception of Socrates. And once again, Stefan is attempting to connect this to the modern world, to how he thinks movies and TV shows and other forms of entertainment are propaganda, how he thinks they've been programming people to be leftists. For Stefan, the word art seems to mean that which is appreciated aesthetically. But that definition, it should be noted, is quite different than what the word art would have meant in Greek, where it's more like the word craft. If you were a shoemaker in ancient Greece, shoemaking was your art. And this is actually etymologically related to the word techne, the root of the modern English word technology, which is what comes about when you get better and better at making crafts. Similarly, the word poem or poema in Greek has to do with something that has been produced with excellent craftsmanship. And this fact, I think, would have been interesting to Stefan because it would have meant that the Greeks would have been pretty much immune to the idea that Jackson Pollock is a great artist. Oh, and by the way, I'm also skipping through the first part of Stefan's discussion of the symposium because, again, he falls back into some weird theories about how homosexuality and Platonism are linked, so we're going to skip past that.
So although Plato promoted the image of two lovers being each other's joined halves, he actually viewed physical or sexual contact between lovers as degraded and wasteful forms of intimate expression. So it's not too uncommon for people who have this ultra-purist, abstract, idealized version of the truth to view, messy, sexual, earthy, mammalian biology and rutting, so to speak, as icky, as I guess you could say, infused with ooiness. And that's one of the things that kind of happens, and not too shocking, right? And because for heterosexual people, sex, makes children, right? So the idea that it's degraded and wasteful, it's like, well, that's why we're all here. It's why we draw breath. It's why we have a world and a culture and a civilization. So saying that sexuality is just sort of degraded and wasteful when it produces children is kind of hard to sustain. But of course, in the gay community back then at the time, there was no gay marriage and there was no gay adoption, of course. And so back then, it's easier to see how he could come to that. Now, the power of erotic love must be channeled, according to Plato, into higher pursuits, right? The goal and the end goal of all of this is knowledge of the form of beauty. Or people would be doomed to lives of frustration, sadly squandering the potential power of love by limiting themselves to the mere pleasures of physical beauty and sexuality. Now, again, if your sexuality does not produce children and pair bond you with a wife or a husband and so on, then yeah, I can kind of understand that. And also, just remember, as an aging gay man, Plato would have been passed up for the physical attractiveness of younger, well-oiled, often nude athletes in the Greek tradition. So the idea that he would then say, well, it's physical beauty and sexuality is a degraded blah, 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 blah. Again, there's some motivation.
No. Several things here. First off, the idea of eros being two halves joined together comes from the character Aristophanes in the Symposium and not from the mouth of Socrates. So that's error number one. Secondly, Stefan draws some rather ridiculous conclusions from Socrates' gayness. Or because he likes Socrates, he says Plato here. For the record, there was no gay community in 400 BC, not in the sense that we mean it today. There was no identity called homosexuality, where people distinguished themselves into categories based on, I have preference for males and I have a preference for females or whatever. Instead, what you had was an upper aristocratic class, and these folks typically would have had wives and children, but they would also, because of their privileged position in society, somewhat freely indulge themselves on youthful flesh. And in ancient Athens, this pederasty was typically aimed towards boys. This sexual predation was an expression of social dominance. In fact, the first description of love in the Symposium comes from Pausanias, who's an old man. He's the lover in the lover-beloved situation, if you catch my drift. This was not men acting effeminately in order to seduce other men. It was men using their position of power and authority to extract sexual favors. Thirdly, the idea that Platonic love has to do with Plato being gay and getting older without a family, that's just nonsense. For one thing, getting older and being freed from the passions of youth happens to everyone. The aging poet Sophocles famously said when asked, "Are you still the man you once were?" said, "Peace. Most gladly have I escaped the thing of which you speak. I feel as if I have escaped a mad and furious master." Lastly, all that sex is icky stuff that Stefan talks about does not actually come from Plato, but rather from later Neoplatonism. When Plato describes Socrates as unaffected by the beauty of Alcibiades and Agathon, what Plato's trying to do is demonstrate that Socrates was a true lover of wisdom and not engaging in philosophy for the sexual favors, as many were at the time. Okay, skipping through some of Plato's contributions to mathematics, and now we're getting to the home stretch.
So, of course, it's so funny. It's so strange to me. So you don't say that Plato is an excellent introduction to astronomy. Why? Because he's wrong. There's no spheres and no crystalline blah, 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 right? He's completely and totally wrong. Got everything wrong about the placement and nature and physics of the solar system or the universe as a whole, right? He's totally... So why would you say, well, Plato is an excellent introduction to science. Plato is an excellent introduction to astronomy and physics and so on. You wouldn't say that because he's wrong. But there's more evidence for his perspective on the solar system and the stars than there is for the world of the forms. At least they knew that the moon was closer to the Earth than Saturn, right? So there's true elements within what he says based upon the measurements of the planets, right? So he's more accurate in his astronomy than he is in his metaphysics. He's more accurate in his astronomy than he is in his epistemology, in his study of knowledge.
Oh boy. This is a good place to talk about what it is that makes philosophy and philosophers important. If I lived in the ancient world and I was pretty clever, I might notice that the tides come in and out at regular intervals. Perhaps if I were really clever, I might create some sort of rudimentary clock from the positioning of the tides. But let's say someone else comes along and figures out how to make a sundial with just a flat surface and a stick. Well, then you don't need my old tide clocks anymore, do you? Similarly, when you construct a scientific system on the planets and the sun traveling around the Earth, and then someone comes along and makes it all make so much more sense by putting the sun in the center, you can throw out the old theory and proceed with the new one. Philosophy's not like that at all, because philosophy has to do with the cultivation of the mind, and not merely the updating of scientific theory. Philosophy never really throws out what came before, but instead branches out from it and builds on it. The way I like to think about it is this. There are certain thoughts that, once you think them, they can never be unthunk. Once you have a particular eureka moment and you understand something, you can't go back to a time when you didn't understand it. Philosophy is like that. It's actually a series of these unthinkable thoughts, all of which build off of one another. I think Stefan's starting philosophy at the wrong end. I think he starts with a particular type of Enlightenment ideology. Enlightenment philosophers were known for throwing off old philosophy and trying to start over, projects which failed miserably, by the way. And then Stefan goes back to read Plato through his Enlightenment ideological prism. What I think he must do, is reset his brain. He needs to go back and read Plato again, only this time he should let himself be open to the idea that what Socrates is saying might actually be true, even true with a capital T. Ooh. And then he can move beyond Plato to the other philosophers, proceeding through the different steps of Western philosophy until you arrive at Ludwig von Mises. Then you can actually see how he measures up to them and not the other way around. Okay, on to Stefan's conclusions.
All right. Shall I do conclusions? Okay, I'll do a couple of conclusions.
Okay, go ahead, Stefan.
All right, so let's start charitably, and we may not end up quite so charitably, but the charitable, and I think somewhat valid, explanation as to the source of Plato's tyrannical nature is that the man was shaped by a story of heartbreak, and the heartbreak, of course, was the murder of his beloved mentor Socrates by the mob.
By the government.
So his work is written under the shadow of threat, under the shadow of murder, and he did face extraordinary dangers for his philosophical pursuits,
Wasn't
particularly,
really
of course,
murder,
when he involved himself in the
by the
world
way.
of politics. When you look at the mob and say, well, it's you or me, brother, either the mob rises up and kills the philosophers, or the philosophers use sophistry to control the mob. You can't reason with the mob, according to Socrates, and therefore you just have to lie to them. And this is called the source of the noble lie, which is you lie to people about society and about their natures, and that they're divided into the three categories of gold, silver, and bronze. You lie to people, but it's a noble lie because it restrains their violence and their self-destructive tendencies, and it keeps them under control, right? Like you lie to people the same way that some people lie to kids. And like I remember when I was a kid, I was told I had to brush my teeth, otherwise sugar fairies would dance on the enamel at night and break through with their Michael Flatley-style bouncing nutsack footsteps. And so I brushed my teeth. It was a noble lie, because at least it got kids to brush their teeth, right?
So very wrong and terrible. To show you how, I'm going to use Stefan's own logic to prove that he himself is a tyrant. Stefan believes and spreads a noble lie. As a hyper-individualist, he believes in something he calls free will. Of course, free will is not something that can be empirically proven. But that doesn't stop him from spreading his anti-rational idea, as he might call it. And why is he so devoted to this lie? It's because it is a helpful illusion which enables him to sustain a style of politics that promotes individual freedom. in order to sell his hyper-individualism, which calls taxation theft and self-sacrifice stupid, etc., etc., there must be free will, you see. Now, is what I just said fair to Stefan? Of course not. But neither is his description of Plato. And it's worth giving a description of what Socrates' noble lie really does, because it lies at the very heart of civilization. The noble lie Socrates was talking about was part of how the Western world moved from tribal government systems, families ruled by patriarchs, to republican forms of government. The word republican, or republic, of course, meaning commonwealth, the plot of land which has borders and which the whole community has a stake in. The noble lie described by Socrates in the Republic is a republican myth. Socrates describes people being born from the soil rather than from their parents or from their tribe. And this means that they're born into a particular settled way of living suitable to their particular environment. It's fine to be critical of this myth, which creates a tribe-transcending, heartfelt connection between a people and their motherland. But if you're going to criticize it, you should at least know what you're criticizing, and not say, oh, look how terrible Socrates is for spreading a lie.
So he saw his beloved mentor murdered by the mob. He was not able to reason with the mob, and therefore he's like, well, I got to be in charge, and I got to control you because it's you or me. And that's a challenge. Now, one of the reasons he couldn't reason with the mob was because of the theory of forms, right? This ideal abstract universe of blah, 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 right? Truth is falsehood, falsehood is truth, anti-empiricism is empiricism, and so on. So you can't talk about that with people. You can't reason with them. You can't show them evidence of it. And so if the ultimate good and the ultimate truth is beyond explication, you can't talk about it with people. Of course you've got to dictate and dominate them. Of course, right?
Right. Because Socrates did so much dictating and dominating. Oh, wait. He was dialoguing and convincing.
It's sort of like if you can't explain to your kids why running into the road is dangerous, you just got to hold their hand. You got to build a fence around your yard. You got to, you don't want to end up as a bit player in some movie about Pet Sematary, right? So that is important. Now, I don't know if his fear of the mob led to the forms or if the forms led to the fear of the mob, or it's all wrapped up in the death of Socrates, but that's one of the reasons why. Now, the forms is a false hypothesis. It is a false conjecture. And we know this by its very definition, its very nature. It is cheating to the nth degree to invent a realm where anti-rationality equals rationality, where anti-empiricism equals empiricism, where contradiction equals consistency. That is cheating.
What you're saying is cheating.
And we wouldn't accept that in any rational universe.
I don't accept that you've made a rational argument.
Let's say that someone borrows $500 from you, and then they don't pay you back. And you say, hey, man, you owe me $500. Can you pay me back? He's like, no, I paid you back, but in another universe. In another universe, this debt is perfectly settled, and that's the higher universe, and that's the more pure universe, so stop bothering me for your money. It's like, no, you've not paid my debt. You've just invented a realm where the debt is paid and say that your debt is paid. That's not reality. That's not
anything.
That's not even
anything anyone has done ever in the history of the world.
So
including
inventing an alternative universe where error equals accuracy, where falsehood equals truth,
that doesn't make
where
sense.
Non-existence equals ultimate existence, is cheating. It's not philosophy. It's not
You're
philosophy
not engaging in a
at
rebuttal
all. And
of
we would never accept
right
these,
now.
mathematics, right? You go to Plato and you say 2 and 2 make 5, he's going to say you're wrong. You say, no, in the realm of forms, 2 and 2 make 5. He's like, well, no, my forms disagree with your forms, and because we can't negotiate, what happens? One of us has to submit to each other. Like, we can handshake in rationality and in reality. Empirical reality and reason allows us to negotiate with a third party called reason and evidence that we are all going to submit our judgment to, right? In an ideal sense, that's how science works, right? The empirical test determines whose hypotheses and conjectures turn out to be accepted or valid, at least conditionally based upon new evidence.
Again, what's happening here is utter confusion based on massive errors in the use of terms. Empiricism is conflated with rationality, philosophy is conflated with theology, and reality is conflated with the material world. And through this confusion, Stefan insists, despite all available evidence, empirical or otherwise, that the theory of the forms is somehow a Nietzschean power grab.
So, in terms of human disputes, how are we going to resolve human disputes? Well, philosophy, rational philosophy, says that we resolve human disputes according to reason and evidence.
Or by dialogue.
But the world of Plato and this psychotic, schizophrenic, dissociated world of forms says, well, we can't negotiate because the forms are intuitive. So the only way that we're going to resolve human disputes is through tyranny. I'm in charge, you obey, or we kill you.
Once again, this fundamentally misunderstands what Plato is doing when he flips the script on the Athenian rulers who are accusing and condemning Socrates by telling them that philosophers should be kings.
Irrationality or anti-rationality,
which is not a thing,
turns the free market into the mafia. Comply or die. And that's basically the law. That's the role of the state, comply or die. So the fact that he has these forms and then it results in tyranny is entirely predictable, and it shows the consistency that Plato had with the insanity of his metaphysics.
Insanity?
No, higher reason is a cop-out. Higher truth, truth with a capital T, it's a complete cop-out.
Ooh, those capital letters
and
again.
It's a will-to-power scenario. And it's terrible.
Terrible.
It's terrible, and we can see these collectives all over the place at the moment. The rich, right? The race, the white privilege, all of these collective concepts that are considered more important than the individual and are used to dominate and bully. Like, we can handshake in reality.
No, we're not talking about Plato anymore.
But if you have an anti-rational metaphysics and reality is higher truth, blah, 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 you can't negotiate. You can't reason with each other. So it's like pushing two pieces of paper together. Like, one has to go on top and one has to go on the bottom. That's about it. One has to dominate, one has to submit. That's what the price of anti-rationality is brutality, tyranny, violence, threats, and domination.
More conflation. This time, the Platonic idea that forms exist is conflated with intractable religious dogma. But at least now I know what he's getting at with his odd term anti-rational. What Stefan means is just nonsense when it's used in a belligerent way, including what are for him the unmeaning leftist buzz phrases like white privilege.
Which is why postmodernism has given birth to feral leftism that relies on violence instead of argument. Because once you attack reason, once you undermine reason, what are you left with?
That's not a very good diagnosis of leftism.
That's all that's left. It's the only way to negotiate in the absence of reason is the fist, which is why Plato's ideal societies and even his practical societies are, well, it's what O'Brien says to Winston Smith in 1984. Imagine a boot stamping on the human face forever.
Right.
That's Plato's world.
Sounds a lot like Plato's
world.
world.
The idea that this is some great introduction to philosophy is terrifying. It's terrifying.
You need to read it again.
Now, the defense of slavery is something worth touching on as well. So, think of the number of technological things. Sorry, that's a really, really bad way of putting it. Imagine the number of machines that are facilitating this conversation, or me talking to you, right?
Okay.
I mean, we've got the microphone, we've got the computer, we've got a camera, we've got the network lines, data lines, the computer servers, the YouTube, whoever, right? And then you can see, there's a huge amount of machinery. Like a friend of mine was driving me to an airport when I was away a while back ago. And, sort of like, yeah, well, if suppression online continues, this is how I'm going to have to do my podcast, is just accept rides from people and give them a live podcast in their car by person, right? Or I used to sometimes think about the distribution of what it is that I do and how it would have been done in the past. In the past, I wrote a long poem about the mind-body dichotomy, an epic poem about the mind-body dichotomy, and I recorded it on a cassette tape and sent it to a friend. This is back when I was working up north. So can you imagine if you wanted my podcast, I'd have to send you a crate the size of half a truck full of cassette tapes, and you'd have to find them and play them. And, it would be insane. It would be thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars. as opposed to you can just, click and, right? And if you want to help out, listen, freedomainradio.com/donate. This is the culmination of 35 years of philosophy, so it's really concentrated, and I hope that you find value in it. And please, please help me out.
I'm trying to help you out,
continue
Stefan.
this work. There's so many other things I would like to do. This is my favorite stuff of all. And freedomainradio.com/donate. Please, please, please help out. So think of the amount of automation and machinery that facilitates this conversation. And it is a conversation. Like, I will check the comments, I will look, and I will respond.
So.
If people got good arguments or want to correct me on stuff, I'll engage for sure. I'm not going to pretend this is all
I hope
absolutely
you engage.
perfect.
I really do.
It's what happens when you don't script, but I like the spontaneity of speaking off the cuff for the most part. So Plato relied upon slaves. That was his perception. Right? How do you have the academy?
All societies
you have
at
the
that time
academy
relied on slavery.
because you have people doing the work for you. It's sort of like the CEOs in the West now believe that they need all of this H-1B visa labor and labor coming in from overseas and so on.
Not exactly the same thing.
When they don't. Of course they don't. I mean, there's plenty of domestic people who can do the work, and also they'll just end up automating that which they don't hire for, right? Just
invent.
Say, without the illegal
machine.
immigrants, there won't be anyone to pick crops. It's nonsense. Complete nonsense. So they just automate. I mean, you can automate the picking of grapes. They already have automated the picking of strawberries and grapes and other things. So it's sort of like saying, well, without slaves, who's going to pick the cotton? It's like, well, it turns out they got some pretty cool ways to get cotton picked without slaves.
Okay, this is a weirdly out of context argument. The argument is supposed to be that the American South stagnated economically while the North industrialized, and that this is because of an entrenched and leisurely way of life in the South on the back of slaves. And there's truth to that argument, but it doesn't really apply in the same way in Athens. Yes, Athens did have slaves, and yes, Athens was aristocratic in a lot of ways, and this did affect the philosophy of both Plato and Aristotle. But the idea that simply freeing all of the slaves would have, at the time, led to industrial revolution is just silly.
So, because Plato believed that philosophy was dependent upon slavery, that without slavery there would not be any excess wealth to subsidize philosophy, he can't get to universality in his ethics. Neither could Aristotle, because Aristotle was all, well, if you're a citizen, right? Because Aristotle was totally justified slavery. Right? He said slaves are the possession of the family and property of the master or the family. Slavery is natural, said Aristotle, and beneficial to both the slave and the master, and so on. So, but they couldn't get to true universality, like what I call universally preferable behavior, which is moral rules independent of personhood, location, time, true universals. They couldn't get there, because they could not conceive of machinery that could replace slavery. And slavery, of course, has been a human institution since there were humans 150,000 years ago or so slavery has just been around forever. So,
okay,
none of the ancients could get to universality because the society was so heavily dependent upon slavery that the idea of universality in humanity, universal human rights or anything, that completely couldn't get there. They could not get there. And this is what happens when you bypass principles, right? When you bypass principles and go for consequences, because deep down they feared that the consequence of ending slavery would be the end of philosophy, and they kind of liked being able to opine at the academy rather than toil in the fields. So, of course, the end of slavery was the Industrial Revolution, so the end of serfdom as well. So that's kind of important, right?
Okay, here Stefan is using the term universality in a weird way. Plato and Aristotle's ethics were plenty universal. They had explanations for everything and roles for every different kind of person to fulfill, even if that role was manual labor or slavery for the low IQ ones. What Stefan means is that the ancients didn't discover egalitarianism, the idea that every human being has equal value and deserves equal rights. For the West to get there, they'll need Judaic influence.
So, I think his fear and his horror at what happened to Socrates had him give up on reasoning with the masses.
No, he did
and
not give
therefore,
up on
we are
reason.
surrounded by
the
dangerous
guy who
beasts. How do we
wrote
tame them? We tame
dialogues,
them through
reasoning
tyranny.
dialogue,
That's
did not give up on
his
reason.
answer. And of course, he would say that they're going to be, the mob is happier if they're being dominated or controlled by a philosopher king, because the
Not
philosopher king
the
knows
point
and
of
is
the
wise,
philosopher
and
king.
the mob is scary, right? The mob can be scary. The mob can be dangerous. And the
democracy
sophists who
that's
whip up
scary,
the
not
mob,
the mob.
against rational thinkers are very dangerous. They are the greatest danger in society because you can take precautions against a transmitted germ, but it's really, really hard to hide from an angry mob whipped up by dangerous sophists. So
Not sophists, the demagogue.
it is natural. And given Plato's fear of the mob, and given Plato's abandonment of any capacity to reason with the mob.
That never happened.
So his fear of the mob would lead him to a place where he would have no need to negotiate.
This harkens back to something that Stefan had said earlier, where he basically created a huge rift between Plato and Socrates. Supposedly, Socrates was the good guy running around and reasoning and dialoguing with people, and Plato was Judas to Socrates' Jesus. He used Socrates to push his evil statist ideas that Socrates never would have endorsed. It wasn't Socrates who described the ideal city in the Republic. No, that was Plato. Socrates was too good of a guy to have said anything collectivist like that. This is, of course, anarcho-capitalist ideology talking. Anything bad attributed to Socrates that's just Plato. All the good stuff, that's Socrates. To debunk this, just ask yourself, who do you think knew and understood Socrates better? Plato or Stefan Molyneaux?
He would have no need to negotiate with the mob because he felt you can't negotiate with the mob. He watched Socrates try and fail and be killed. So this is the truth about Plato.
Okay, here we go.
That he gave up on negotiation.
No, he didn't.
He gave up on rationality
No, he definitely didn't.
and succumbed to the thirst for power.
Ah, yes, the power-hungry Plato.
Because he couldn't reason with anyone.
Couldn't reason with anyone?
He wanted to dominate everyone.
The guy most well
and
known for
everything,
reason dialogues
forever.
couldn't reason with
And
anyone?
that very dangerous thread has remained very much alive, even to our time.
Doesn't even sound like
This is
Plato.
Stefan Molyneaux from Freedomain. Thank you so much for watching.
I also hope you enjoyed this video breakdown of Stefan Molyneux's 4-hour-long video called The Truth About Plato. And I hope, through it, you've caught a glimpse of why Stefan Molyneux's summary of Plato is so utterly wrong. 180 degrees from correct. Despite the fact that Plato was born 2,000 years before the words individual rights became vogue, he was one of the most impressive proponents of reason and political discourse that ever existed in history. I hope you also notice that Stefan Molyneux's analysis says more about Stefan Molyneaux than it says about Plato. Stefan gets so triggered by anything that smacks of collectivism, including the very words common good, that he can't read ancient texts with any modicum of understanding, but he is instead enslaved to his own ideological reactions against it. I honestly think that this video, The Truth About Plato, does a disservice to everyone who listens to it by training them not to take Plato's ideas seriously, which may be Stefan's point. Stefan might think that he's saving the world from tyranny by getting people to dismiss Plato's ideas. But what he's really doing is promoting the ignorant dismissal of the received historical wisdom of the West. That is precisely what the modern left, his sworn enemies, do. And I hope in the future Stefan will rise above that. The next time we hear from Stefan Molyneaux, I hope we hear the truth about Plato, rather than a rigidly ideological anarcho-capitalist hot take on Plato. Thanks for listening. Stay tuned for more upcoming philosophy videos from ThinkOutsidePolitics.com.
Think outside politics, yeah!